Welcome to this first test episode of Naval Battles That Never Happened, where we take a look at hypothetical engagements between warships that never happen. Today we're going to be going back to 1904 to compare some British and American pre-dreadnought battleships in a scenario I'm calling the Battle of St. John's Harbor. So first, I'll start with some historical background, then go on to talk about the ships involved, then the battle itself, and then I'll talk about the game system and methodology I used. So let's get started with some historical background, that I made up, of course. In April of 1904, a brief argument via telegram between U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour over the spelling of the word harbor brings both superpowers to the tipping point. The United States dispatches the battleships USS Maine and USS Kearsarge from the North Atlantic Squadron to blockade St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland until the local authorities recognize the correct spelling of harbor. In response, the Royal Navy detaches the battleships HMS London and HMS Irresistible to travel to Newfoundland and protect British spelling and, to a lesser extent, fishing interests. For some context, St. John's is the capital of Newfoundland, which I believe wasn't technically part of Canada in 1904, but I don't feel like digging into that. I'm American, Canada's just there to me. In any case, the Royal Navy would be responsible for its defense. That would be defense with a C. St. John's Harbor, as you already probably deduced, is Newfoundland's largest harbor and apparently a major exporter of salmon. So, let's discuss the forces that participated in this battle, starting with the Americans. First off, just to clarify, since this is 1904, the USS Maine we're talking about is not the Maine that we're always supposed to remember, designated ACR-1, but a later design launched in 1901, designated BB-10. USS Maine was the lead ship of her class of 3 pre-dreadnought battleships, and was a significant advance over most American battleships built up to then. The earlier U.S. designs were low freeboard coastal defense battleships that tended to have poor seakeeping qualities and were not very stable gun platforms. The Maine class and the preceding Illinois class were the first to be built with ocean-going capability in mind. As with most pre-dreadnoughts of this era, Maine's primary battery consisted of 2 twin turrets of 12-inch guns, one fore and one aft. Her secondary armament of 16 6-inch guns were distributed along the side of the hull in armored casemates, while her tertiary armament of 6 3-inch guns were also in armored casemates. She had a light battery consisting of 8 3-pounders and 6 1-pounders to keep away torpedo boats, and of course a pair of submerged torpedo tubes, one on each side, although some sources indicate 2. Her main armor belt was 11 inches at its thickest, with 12 inches on the turrets. Maine's armor consisted of both Krupp cemented and Harvey steel armor. Relative to her contemporaries, she was well armored, and her belt didn't sit too low in the waterline like early American battleships. She also had a top speed of 18 knots. Her commander at the time would have been Captain Eugene H.C. Lutz, who will act as the American squadron commander for this battle. Moving on to USS Kearsarge, designated BB-5, was slightly older and less capable, launched in 1898. As mentioned earlier, she was built as a coastal defense battleship and sat rather low in the water, giving her poor seakeeping capability. Additionally, her armament had a rather unconventional layout. Her main battery of 13-inch guns were in 2 twin turrets, one fore and one aft, as usual. However, the secondary battery of 8-inch guns were in 2 twin turrets fixed atop the 13-inch turrets. Being fixed to the main gun turrets, this meant that the secondary battery couldn't be independently trained. Nonetheless, while innovative, this arrangement proved problematic, to say the least. Additionally, Kearsarge carried 14 5-inch guns in armored casemates, along with 20 6-pounder guns with little to no armor. She carried 8 1-pounder guns for defense against torpedo boats, and 4 torpedo tubes. Her armor belt was 16.5 inches at its thickest, and there were 15 to 17 inches of armor on the turrets. While this was completely made of the less efficient Harvey face-hardened armor, the relative protection offered was still greater than that on the Maine. It should be noted that because of her low freeboard, the armor belt sat very low in the water, somewhat reducing its effectiveness. Her top speed was 16 knots, which was considered sufficient at the time. Her commander was Captain Raymond P. Rogers. On the British side, we have the pre-dreadnoughts HMS London and HMS Irresistible. Now, for the British, this is going to be a lot easier because both ships were essentially the same other than their armor layout. Some historians consider them both to be part of the formidable class of pre-dreadnought battleship, with the London and her similarly armored sisters making up the London subclass. However, more commonly, they're simply referred to as the London class. Both ships carried a main battery of breech-loading 12-inch guns in two twin turrets, one forward and one aft. Their secondary battery consisted of 12 casemate-mounted 6-inch guns, spread along the hull in the usual fashion. The tertiary battery was made up of 16 quick-fire 12-pounder guns, also mounted in casemates. And finally, they carried 6 3-pounder quick-fire guns for dealing with those torpedo boats. And, of course, we can't forget 4 submerged torpedo tubes. Both ships were also capable of 18 knots. Now, in terms of armor thickness and type, both London and Irresistible were nearly identical. Both had a 9-inch belt at its thickest, 10-inch thick armor on the turrets, and 6 inches of armor on the casemates. They used a mix of Krupp, Harvey, nickel steel, and mild steel as armor. The difference was that London's armor scheme layout was incrementally improved over the Formidable class, much like the Formidable class was over the preceding Duncan class. In comparison to the American battleships, London and Irresistible were less protected, but this was because they were designed with the intent of protecting Britain's colonies around the world, while the American ships were mostly based around coastal defense. Now, in researching the British captains, I couldn't find any photographs, so instead I'll be using these drawings of period Royal Navy uniforms as stand-ins. Commanding the HMS London at the time was Captain Philip Francis Tillard, who is also going to act as the squadron commander here, while HMS Irresistible was commanded by Captain George Morris Henderson. An interesting side note, while I couldn't find any photographs of the British captains, there were still some very extensive and easy to find records of who commanded what ship and when, thanks to the dreadnoughtproject.org. I'll link to them in the description. Meanwhile, the records for the US Navy took a little more digging, but pictures were easy to find. Now that all that information's out of the way, let's get on to the battle. The situation is that the American battleships are holding position at the entrance to the Narrows, leading to the harbor. Several merchant ships attempting to enter the harbor were stopped, boarded, and then turned away due to incorrect spelling on their manifests. Since then, no ships have entered or left the harbor, and the next day the Americans were informed of the British ships heading to engage them. The American orders are as follows. Blockade St. John's Harbor until correct spelling has been implemented. Any approaching British forces should be considered hostile and engaged if attempting to break the blockade. Meanwhile, the British orders are simply break the blockade and drive off the American warships attempting to force their barbaric spelling on the locals. It's April 29th, 1904, 10:30 hours. The wind is calm, conditions are sea state 2, and visibility is about 80%. While the battleships are anchored outside the harbor, the British squadron approaches from the east at 18 knots in line formation. HMS Irresistible is 400 yards behind HMS London. At 10:33 hours, lookouts aboard the USS Maine spot the approaching British vessels at 9,000 yards. A startled Captain Leutz demands to know how they got so close without being noticed at first, and is informed his lookouts were apparently taking turns staring to the sun. After replacing the offending lookouts, Captain Leutz orders both ships to weigh anchor and intercept the approaching British ships. By the time the American ships are underway and building up to 3 knots, it's 10:36, and the British are about 7,000 yards away. Being as gentlemanly as possible, Captain Tillard on HMS London sends a message via signal light to the Americans. Break off or be fired upon. Captain Lutz receives this message on the Maine, and in response orders his 12-inch forward turret to fire a warning shot across London's bow. At 10:39, Maine fires the warning shot. Unfortunately, the message isn't received as clearly as intended, and Captain Tillard opens fire, believing that he's already been fired upon. At a range of 4,750 yards, with both formations steaming for each other, HMS London's forward turret and its few 6-inch guns that can be brought to bear fire at Maine. The shots land within 150 yards of the ship. Captain Leutz orders the helm hard port, turning to the north, and orders his men to fire at will. The crew of Kearsarge does not appear to notice the change of heading and continues steaming at 6 knots towards the British for another few hundred yards before Captain Rogers gives the order to come to the same bearing as Maine. Meanwhile, both British ships slow to 13 knots. At 10:42, the distance between the two squadrons is 3,450 yards. Maine and Kearsarge open fire with their forward, main, and secondary guns. Almost immediately after, a 12-inch shell from London hits Maine on an open 3-pounder gun position, blowing it to pieces and causing general havoc on the deck. Soon thereafter, a 13-inch shell from Kearsarge hits London's forward funnel, punching a hole clean through it, but doing little damage otherwise. However, this is when Kearsarge's weapons arrangement begins to cause problems. The concussion from the 13-inch guns firing was enough to stop the 8-inch gun crews from doing their job, taking nearly a minute to recover. At 10:45, Maine finishes her turn northward and brings her rear turret into arc, with both Maine and Kearsarge moving at 9 knots. Meanwhile, Captain Tillard orders the London to turn northward in order to bring her full broadside to bear. The range is now 2,500 yards, with London now out of her path. Irresistible opens fire with her forward guns on the closest target, which is USS Kearsarge. Both sides continue trading salvos for several minutes. The only hit scored is by Kearsarge's 8-inch guns, which were finally able to fire, hitting the London near her engine compartment. The shot doesn't penetrate the belt armor, but the impact does enough damage to start a rather serious fire. At 10:48, Kearsarge and London finish their turn to the north, while Irresistible begins her turn. Additionally, London slows to 9 knots due to the chaos in her engineering compartment. Captain Henderson on the Irresistible notices London's speed change and matches it. By now, the range is 2,300 yards, and all ships except the Irresistible begin firing with their tertiary batteries, too. Kearsarge switches targets to the Irresistible being the closer ship, but once again, the blast from her main guns disrupts the firing of her 8-inch turrets. Then, London scores at least 2 hits from firing a full broadside of her 12-inch guns on Maine. The shells punch through her armor, with one exploding in her boiler room and another blasting a hole beneath the waterline. Maine is rocked by the explosion as fires break out throughout the engine compartment, and she begins to take on water. London doesn't escape unscathed, as several of Maine's 6-inch shells impact her hull, failing to penetrate, but bursting some bulkheads and causing flooding on the port side. At 10:51, all ships are now parallel and heading north, with the range between the two squadrons remaining at about 2,300 yards. Each ship is now firing every available weapon at the target, minus the torpedoes, of course, as the gunners on both sides begin to hit more frequently. Kearsarge's 8-inch guns, which are firing again, score several hits along the superstructure of Irresistible, doing a fair amount of damage but not penetrating into the interior of the ship. Both London and Irresistible score numerous hits with their 12-pounder guns across their targets, respectively, causing minor damage to both. The scene on the decks of all the ships is chaotic now, as they're peppered by so many low-caliber shots, killing crewmen and tearing apart anything that isn't armored. Then, a salvo from Maine's 12-inch guns penetrates the casemate armor protecting the 6-inch guns on London, resulting in a massive explosion as one of her secondary magazines detonates, and London slows to 5 knots, with fires burning furiously on deck. Seeing this, Captain Lutz orders his gunners to cease fire. By 10:54, all ships cease fire as the fires on London continue to burn. Crewmen on London valiantly fight the fire as best they can, and additionally manage to contain the minor flooding and the earlier fire. So, this is where I'm going to end the Battle of St. John's Harbor, because this is when I realized I'd been doing critical hits wrong the whole time. The rule system I used was Dawn of the Battleship, Tactical Naval Warfare 1890 to 1904 by the Admiralty Trilogy group. I believe they were formerly Clash of Arms games because they also make Fear God and Dreadnought along with the Harpoon series, and my older copies of those games are from Clash of Arms games. Part of the reason why I'm doing this channel is to make use of these games and familiarize myself with the rule set. In the past, I've only played Harpoon 4 once or twice, and I'm fairly certain we did everything wrong. However, Dawn of the Battleships seems significantly less complicated than Harpoon, as far as I remember, so I figured I'd start there. Should also mention that I added some randomness by rolling a d12 every time a new order was given. If I rolled a 1, something went wrong with that order and it wasn't followed correctly. This is why the Kearsarge didn't turn when it should have, in addition to why Captain Tillard of the London took the American warning shot as hostile action, although that might have been the right call. I also rolled a d12 every time Kearsarge fired her main and secondary guns because of the unusual turret arrangement. On a 1 through 4, the firing of the main guns would interfere with the secondaries, which apparently was what happened in reality, which is why this layout was abandoned, with the exception of the Virginia-class battleships that came after the Maine class. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't figure it out by then. Back to the mistakes I made. First off, I meant to have the British start 30,000 yards east of the harbor. I marked the squadron positions on graph paper rather than using miniatures. However, on turn 1 I realized that the scale was way off. Instead of 30,000 yards away, they were about 10,000 yards away. And rather than restarting, I just decided to write it off as the Americans not paying attention. The big mistake I made was rolling on the critical hit table every time a hit was scored, thinking of it more as a hit location table. This should have raised a red flag right away, since each attack roll accounts for 3 minutes of firing rather than a single salvo. What I was supposed to do was take the damage done by the hit and divide it by the total damage points of the ship, then compare that on a table where a d6 roll determines how many criticals there are, if any. I don't think it would have had much of an impact on this battle. Most of the criticals, other than the final one, were minor. So anyway, rather than redo everything, I just decided to make this video anyway, since it's something of a proof of concept. One of the reasons I chose these ships for this scenario was I wanted to see the difference in the main guns on both, because the British ships' main guns seem to all have a very high penetration but low damage output, whereas the American ships were more balanced. I thought maybe this would balance out the fact that the American ships had heavier armor, but since I was doing critical hits wrong, I kind of goofed it anyway, so I guess we'll find out some other time. So, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it up to this point. I don't know about the editing. I'll have to do that later. Feel free to like and subscribe, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to do more of these videos, maybe get some good equipment, maybe come up with a clever sign-off. Oh, and you can always comment below and tell me I'm wrong about, whatever, life in general, pronunciation. I'm sure I got that wrong. So, until next time, safe sailing? Yeah, I guess that'll work for now.